Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I figured we'd get started here. My name is Kurt Jaros, and I'm the Executive Director of Defenders Media. I'm also the host of the Veracity Hill podcast, and it's a blessing to be with you here this week. This is the first talk I'm giving, and on Thursday I will be giving a talk critiquing Van Tillian presuppositionalism. So I guess both of my sessions are a bit more on the advanced level. And before I begin, and I have a strong inclination as to a strong amount of people have heard of undesigned coincidences before. If you have, please raise your hand. Okay, great. And how many of you have heard of the Synoptic Problem? Yes, great. Okay, good. So everyone's got some familiarity, so I won't spend too much time giving a rundown on the Synoptic Problem. I will be giving an explanation of undesigned coincidences. I'm sure that some of my anticipated objections will be to ensure that I understand the argument properly. So why don't we first ask the question, well, what is an undesigned coincidence? Well, they were first discovered, or maybe the argument was pioneered, by William Paley in the 18th century. And it was expanded and popularized in the 19th century by J.J. Blunt, who took the style of the argument and applied it to the rest of Scripture. J. Warner Wallace, in his book Cold Case Christianity, calls them unintentional eyewitness support. Two other definitions or descriptions come from the two analytic philosophers in the back, very intelligent, good Christian folks, the McGrews. Lydia describes it as a notable connection between two or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts, despite their apparent independence. The items fit together like pieces of a puzzle. And Tim has described it in a talk a few years back. Sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were from the other or both were copied from a common source. So the argument from undesigned coincidences includes many, many examples throughout all four Gospels and beyond, including Acts and the Pauline epistles. Many of these examples, I think, are very good examples of an undesigned coincidence. So any concerns that I may be bringing to you this afternoon are not in principle opposed to the argument. Lydia has written, in order to appreciate undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, you do not have to decide whether Mark or Matthew was written first, or solve the puzzles that surround Matthew, Mark, and Luke, known as the Synoptic Gospels. What McGrew here means is that these instances are so numerous that the argument goes beyond the issues of what's called the Synoptic Problem. So we don't have to pin down which one of the three Synoptic Gospels was written first, which one was second, and which one was last. J. Warner Wallace, describes this phenomenon, the undesigned coincidences. He says that the accounts puzzle together just the way one would expect from independent eyewitnesses. When one gospel eyewitness described an event and left out a detail, that raised a question. This question was unintentionally answered by another gospel writer. He continues on, this independence between the accounts could be explained in one of two ways. It may have been that the writers worked together, writing at precisely the same time and location, to craft a clever lie so subtle that very few people would even notice it at all. The second possibility is that the Gospels were written by different eyewitnesses who witnessed the events and included these unplanned supporting details. Let's take one example. This example comes from Cold Case Christianity. Jim Wallace uses it in his book. It's commonly referred to maybe as the striking of Jesus. Sometimes these undesigned coincidences may go by other labels. So, in Cold Case Christianity, he describes three alleged undesigned coincidences. One of them is this one. The McGrews have stepped away from this example. Lydia says maybe they're not valueless. There could be some value. And as I will later explain, maybe there's greater value depending upon your view of the Synoptic Problem. So, I'll talk about that. So, Matthew 26, then they spat in his face and beat him, that is Jesus, with their fists. And others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one that hit you? Well, there might be a question that arises from this. why is it that they ask of Jesus, "Who hit you?" It's a perplexing question. So here we have the answer in Luke. "Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?'" So here in Matthew we have this sort of unfinished or incomplete picture. Maybe something odd's happened and you don't have that information. Well, what if we see one of the other Gospels, and you see with Luke, what we see that they blindfolded him. So in this way, the Gospels sort of interlock. They work together. They help each other to corroborate what happened. Okay, so there are some issues with this example, as the McGrews have noted. It could be the case here that if Luke were written before Matthew, as some scholars believe, so one of those might be Richard Bauckham. If Luke was written before Matthew, and if Matthew had access to Luke, it could be the case that Matthew simply redacted or edited out the blindfold. And so we're just sort of left here with this case. That would explain the phenomenon that we see. But there's another explanation as well, and that comes from Mark, which reads, "They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." So here, if Mark wrote first before the other two, regardless of whether Matthew was before Luke or Luke before Matthew, then either of them could have used Mark as source criteria, which means that neither Matthew nor Luke would be independent. They would have been dependent upon Mark as a source. And it's on this basis that the McGrews have refrained from using this example from, I think, 7 years ago or so. Okay, so here Lydia explains in her book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And if you want a great sort of 1 hour rundown of this, I did an interview with Lydia a couple years ago on her book, where we went through a number of these examples. So she explains the "who struck you" coincidence between Luke and Matthew. It could have arisen this way, since Matthew could have merely included one piece of information contained in Mark. Okay, so as we've just gone through, we've seen how one example of an alleged undesigned coincidence is complicated by the synoptic problem. We are unsure of the relationship of the synoptic gospels. So it may seem perplexing then for McGrew to claim that the argument from undesigned coincidences therefore swings free, as she pointed out earlier in the introduction, of the vexed issues surrounding the so-called synoptic problem. I think what she means here is that the argument from undesigned coincidences cuts across the debate of the synoptic problem. Whether you think Mark was written first or Matthew, for example, there would be good cases of undesigned coincidences regardless. And I hope that's a fair assessment of her position. I would welcome a critique if I'm not understanding her statement in light of that. My proposal to you this afternoon is this: that the synoptic problem poses some concerns against the value of inter-Synoptic undesigned coincidences. So these are coincidences or alleged coincidences which occur exclusively between the synoptic gospels. This does not include any material from John or Acts or the Pauline epistles. So the argument from undesigned coincidences is a cumulative argument. So you might think that there are many, many good examples. The examples we're going to run through are just a small subset of that. And that is the focus of my talk today. So I'll be arguing that whether the alleged inter-synoptic undesigned coincidences carry weight depends upon one's view of the priority and relationship between the Gospels in conjunction with one's view of source criticism. If you think that some of these examples are weak, you may be left with very few, or as I'll argue, possibly no good examples of inter-synoptic undesigned coincidences. This is J.J. Blunt on the Synoptic Problem. The argument deduced from coincidences without design has further claims because, if well made out, it establishes the authors of the several books of Scripture as independent witnesses to the facts they relate, and this whether they consulted each other's writings or not. For the coincidences, if good for anything, are such as could not result from combination, mutual understanding, or arrangement. And this I really appreciated. He says, if any which I may bring forward may seem to be such as might have arisen, they are only to be reckoned ill-chosen and dismissed. So he's willing to say, hey, maybe I'm wrong. If that's the case, let's just put them aside. So, what is the Synoptic Problem? Again, most of you here are familiar with this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But for those of you who are familiar with New Testament scholarship, you are aware of the meticulous variety of theories put forward to explain this quandary. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, let me just do a brief rundown. So determining what order the Gospels were written in and how, if at all, there was dependence among them is the essence of the Synoptic Problem. The curtain opens slowly on that one. Of the 661 verses in Mark, 500 recur in Matthew in parallel form, and 350 recur in Luke. That's from Craig Blomberg, Jesus and the Gospels. Sometimes these parallel forms occur word for word in the Greek. There is some relationship between these three, and scholars have been debating over what that relationship is. If you're going to be retelling an event and someone else is doing the same thing, it's highly unlikely that you would tell it the same event word for word and a large agreement in the details, unless you were copying. And this happens sometimes verbatim. In the Synoptic Gospels, you have that large agreement, even in the details. And in some, in some or perhaps many cases, there's verbatim agreement. This is the case with the sayings of Jesus, but also for the narrative language itself, which can be critical. Because maybe they memorized the sayings of Jesus, and so they, on their own, remembered these sayings if they were eyewitnesses. But when you have verbatim agreement on narrative language, that's something that, statistically speaking, seems very improbable unless they were copying. And I want to be careful if I'm getting into statistics, because the McGrews are highly statisticians, and I could be corrected perhaps easily later on. But hopefully not. Okay, so taking a look here, this is a chart from Wesley Huff. I want to give him credit for this chart. This describes sort of the commonalities and agreements between the three Gospels, the three Synoptic Gospels. The red is the triple tradition, material common to all three. You have some of the color coding is a bit odd. That's sort of an orange-yellow unique to Matthew, but also Mark and Luke. Maybe you could have gone with the purple or something like that. There is one thing I would disagree with over on the right there. He uses the term virtually identical verses. I wouldn't quite use that language. But this gives you a fairly good idea of a number of things. One, the common agreement between all three. Two, the agreement between two of them. But also three, that there is unique material to each of them. And that certainly is valuable. So I don't think anyone's doubting that there is not independent material in them, at least from where I stand as an evangelical Christian. Maybe there might be some skeptics that think something like that. All right, so here's an important question we need to think about. Are the Synoptic Gospels like crime scene eyewitnesses? And are they separated? This is an example that's used, an analogy that's employed in cold case Christianity. And sometimes we might also employ this analogy when we want to say that we are putting the gospel evangelists on trial in a court of law, for example. While this can be a helpful analogy in a basic understanding of the Gospels for folks that are new to the faith, it is not without, I think, its difficulties. Now, consider McGrew's opening example in her book Hidden in Plain View, where she talks about three people, Alan and Betty, and there's another gentleman, Carl. And Alan and Betty have an experience of a state of affairs. And so if you want to see if they're reliable, what do? You separate them, and you get their testimonies. You see what happened. And maybe they gave one detail here, and another gave one detail here, and those two details line up, and they make sense of each other. That helps to corroborate and interlock their stories, corroborate their stories. But are the Synoptic Gospels like that? They are inexactly like that. What you have sometimes with the Synoptic Gospels is that Alan would have access to Betty's testimony. And maybe he used Betty's testimony in his own testimony. So even that that's sort of a basic look. It gets more complicated than that because there could be a situation where Alan has his own experience of the situation. He also has Betty's experience of the own situation. So maybe he's comparing and contrasting his own with Betty's. So that sort of complicates it a bit further. So in this way, again, the Synoptic Gospels, I think, are inexactly, I don't want to say they're not at all like that, but they are inexactly like crime scene eyewitnesses that are separated. Let me just give a quick rundown of some of the major views on the Synoptic Gospels, on the Synoptic Problem. The classical traditional approach is called the Augustinian model, and it posits that Matthew was first, followed by Mark, and finally Luke. Augustine himself was aware of the intricacies of the issues within the present-day Synoptic Problem, and while he opted for Matthean priority, he did admit that there was dependency among the Gospels. In The Harmony of the Gospels, he says, "And however they may appear to have kept each of them a certain order of narration proper to himself, this certainly is not to be taken as if each individual writer chose to write in ignorance of what his predecessor had done, or left out, as matters about which there was no information, things which another nevertheless is discovered to have recorded." So he sees here that there is some literary relationship between them. The Griesbach model in contemporary scholarship holds a variation on Augustine's position. This view posits Matthew, Luke, and then Mark written last, which today is not very popular at all. Mark and priority. Now, well, for over 100 years, the vast majority of scholars have, based on internal evidence of the Gospels, come to believe that Mark was the first Gospel. Many have even accepted the existence of a hypothetical, non-extant document, Q. Are some of you familiar with that concept of Q? No. Okay, well, so Q is the idea, Q comes from a German word, quell or quelle, which means just source. So there's a hypothetical source that Matthew and Luke used, and there's a lot of debate over this, whether it was written or oral, and some of the scholarship, I think the McGrews and I would certainly agree, goes way too far on this, such as an early Q, a middle Q, a later Q, Q of sayings of Jesus, Q of the miracles, and etc. So I think scholarship certainly does go overboard in that regard. This standard two-source view posits that Matthew and Luke consulted Mark and Q independently of each other. So that is, Luke did not have access to Matthew, but he did to Mark and Q. The Farrer theory, popularly defended by Mark Goodacre at Duke, posits that Luke consulted only Mark and Matthew. So he thinks Mark was written first, then Matthew, and then Luke, but he doesn't think that his theory doesn't require that Q exists. So Luke uses that Q material in Matthew, and therefore there's no need to posit Q's existence. So these are four main theories. There are others that are in the minority, and even the Griesbach one is not all that popular. The most popular theory amongst New Testament scholars is the two-source view. Other evangelicals hold to the Farrer hypothesis, and some folks more sympathetic to a classical approach would hold to the Augustinian view. Okay, so that's it for the Synoptic Problem. So here is an interesting note about undesigned coincidences. The first sentence of Luke's Gospel attests to the fact that he had read many written accounts, even critiquing them as not orderly. Perhaps that word orderly in the Greek maybe carries the connotation of chronological. We're not certain about that. Some scholars have posited that. Craig Blomberg writes, Luke describes the composition of his gospel according to the standard processes of ancient history writing, consulting written sources, learning from oral tradition, interviewing eyewitnesses, selecting what is deemed most important for one's own purposes, and putting the material together with a view toward implementing those objectives. Given the similarities in form between Luke and the other three Gospels, presumably their writers functioned similarly. So consider, if Luke had these written accounts in front of him, or at least read them, then we perhaps should be epistemologically or epistemically cautious of any supposed undesigned coincidence within Luke. Such an undesigned coincidence might be neither undesigned nor coincidental. Luke could simply be providing a designed corroboration. Are there any electricians in the room right now? Music fans? Music fans? Have you heard of AC/DC? Okay, well, this is not AC/DC, this is UC/DC, undesigned coincidences or design corroboration. A design corroboration is a notable connection that is plausibly explained by a planned remark by an author. This I consider a particular design corroboration, or by use of a shared common source. This I consider a general design corroboration. When I consider an author using another author for source material, I don't immediately think collusion, but perhaps in giving the benefit of the doubt, we might suspect that an author's copying comes from a desire to get the facts straight. Thus, the use of a shared common source is an implicit act of designing a corroboration. Design corroborations still carry weight for the veracity of the Gospels, but they aren't seemingly as explanatorily powerful as an undesigned coincidence would be. What I'm suggesting here is that, in other words, our confidence in the degree of the independence of the Gospels should be measured. Some of these cases serve as good examples of the corroboration of events in Jesus' life and ministry, but we should not overstate the case if the rationale is not warranted. Let me repeat, I'm here not necessarily trying to disprove undesigned coincidences. I'm open. Maybe what I'm going to suggest here shortly is mistaken, and maybe these cases do serve as undesigned coincidences, but what I am saying is that the situation is complicated. And again, it's going to depend on your view of the synoptic problem in conjunction with your view of source criticism. So, for an undesigned coincidence to occur, independent access is required. Lydia here writes, by showing that the synoptic gospels have clear signs of independence from each other in information and perspective, while being reliable in those areas where they are independent, the argument from undesigned coincidences allows us to treat the synoptic problem instead as a synoptic puzzle. So they have these clear signs of independence from each other in information and perspective. Elsewhere, the very existence of variety in detail, up to and including apparent discrepancies between different documents and accounts, is strong evidence of their independence, which is in turn important to the positive force of undesigned coincidences between them. Here's Blunt on the matter. It's important that these truths are known independently to each of them, and that must be the bottom of documents. He means the essence there. Having such discrepancies and such agreements as these in question. The point, therefore, whether the authors of the books of Scripture have or have not copied from one another, which in the case of some of them has been so much labored, it thus rendered a matter of comparable indifference. And that's the point, that last clause, I take objection to. I think it does matter for these specific examples. Blunt says, let them have done so, still by our argument their independence would be secured, and the nature of their testimony be shown to be such as could only result from their separate knowledge of substantial facts. So Matthew has his own independent access to the state of affairs, and Mark does as well. So maybe they're writing about the same things, but there may be details in one and not the other that indicate Matthew isn't just using Mark for his source. McGrew echoes this sentiment when she writes, a particular coincidence shows that one of the Synoptic Gospels must have had information independent of another, ergo that Matthew had access to information independent of Mark. So I have now two concerns. First, the independence of the written text is not a guarantee of independence of source material. For example, an editorial maneuver from a common source. This could be the use of a shared document such as Mark or Q. With regard to the striking of Jesus example, we've already demonstrated how the McGrews have realized that there could just be a sort of incomplete copying that has occurred, or even from both of them. So if you take Matthew without the blindfold and Luke with the blindfold, they could have both gotten those pieces from Mark. So that would be an example of both of them using a common source. I want to go a bit further here than just literary documents. This could be the case from oral tradition, where maybe Q is an oral source, or perhaps just beyond Q to simply the oral tradition of the church. The esteemed theologian and scholar Jaroslav Pelikan wrote, in the several decades between the time of the ministry of Jesus and the composition of the various Gospels, the memory of what he had said and done was circulating among the various Christian congregations, and probably beyond them in the form of an oral tradition. Everyone must acknowledge that Christian tradition had precedence, chronologically and even logically, over Christian scripture. For there was a tradition of the church before there was ever a New Testament, or any individual book of the New Testament. So, to help demonstrate this point, think the life and ministry of Jesus. I'm going to pull a Gary Habermas here. Think the life and ministry of Jesus is here, 33 AD. And when was the earliest documents written from the New Testament? Well, it depends on your view. Let's say 45 at the earliest, maybe Paul's letters around that time, mid-40s, late 40s. And then the Gospels even written later. Even by conservative evangelical estimations, you're looking at the 60s. If you're really conservative, maybe 50s. I'm not even sure about that. So there's this time, there's this gap. How do the Christians learn about who Jesus was? Well, there was the teaching of the church, the teaching of the apostles. This is what I call the oral tradition. I use that term from Craig Blomberg's usage of the historical reliability of the Gospels here. If authors pulled, so here's why this is important. If authors pulled from the oral tradition, then it would not be surprising for one author to use a detail and another not. Or all the more so relevant that if both details were in the oral tradition, one of them used one detail and one of them used the other. McGrew has written, if the overlap between the testimonies is correctly explained by design, such as collusion, one's account copying the other, or both accounts copying a common source containing the overlapping information, then the cumulative case is greatly weakened. And that comes from a journal article called Undesigned Coincidences and Coherence for a Hypothesis. Further on, she says, if we knew for certain that the second source simply copied his report from the first and had no other access to the events, we would rightly not consider the coincidence between them to provide any confirmation at all to their reliability. And something similar is true if both sources got their information from a common source rather than having independent access to the facts. So as a second point to my first one, editorial maneuver from one gospel to one's own. So this may not require a common source, but this might be, for example, the striking of Jesus would also apply here if Matthew just redacted out material in Luke. So all of that material was contained. They're parallel accounts. In these cases, authors would have copied from the same source, and thus it hinders the nature of the claim as a coincidence. Chapter 3, yes. All right. Moving along. Oh, let me say this too, actually. And this is maybe where some of the discussion could go forward, perhaps overflow into the next session. The term coincidence. This refers to, allegedly, an unexpected connection between the accounts. So the coincidence occurs in the text. between the Gospels. And again, I'm open to discussing maybe what we mean here by this coincidence. Maybe it's not so surprising, it's not so unexpected for an author to relay an incomplete picture of an event with some details and another do so the same way with different details. But that could just be a semantical issue. All right. My second concern. In the case of independence of information, there could be an authorial intent to provide that information. For example, if Matthew or Luke were confirming details upon Mark's narrative, this could be explained by a case of a planned, notable connection. For example, Matthew or Luke read Mark's account and intentionally added information they had received, but which Mark either or intentionally did not include. And a design corroboration like that would contribute to the confirmation of the historicity of the Gospels, but it would not mean that the corroboration was unplanned or undeveloped. So this is a concern upon the undesignedness. So let's look at 4 more examples of alleged inter-Synoptic undesigned coincidences. These 4 I present in order simply because Lydia has ordered them this way in her chapter on the inter-Synoptic undesigned coincidences. There they are. The pairing of the disciples, Herod speaks to his servants, woe to Bethsaida, and the ownership of a new tomb. Matthew 10 provides a list of the 12 disciples, in pairs, it seems, and separated by a number of ands. Why does he do this, one might ask? And there I provided the verse for you. You can see that there. Some of you are already quite familiar with this. Maybe he does it because it's simple and easy to remember. This is a possible solution that Lydia mentions, but she thinks there's a preferable one. Maybe Matthew's knowledge of the 12 pairing off in ministry work explains his rationale for the ordering. This is supposedly confirmed by Mark 6:7, and he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. All right, here are some concerns over this. Let's suppose that Mark was written first. If Mark wrote his gospel first, then Matthew's listing of the disciples at the commissioning could quite easily be explained by a thematic design corroboration to enlighten readers of those pairings, given the absence of the particular pairings in Mark's gospel. So Mark does provide a list of the disciples earlier on in his gospel, but he doesn't pair them up. So maybe Matthew decides, hey, I'm going to pair them up to explain what Mark means 2 by 2. Or perhaps the case that if Matthew was written first, then Mark simply intentionally summarizes them. Mark reads Matthew's account and says, oh, that's too long, let's condense it. He sent them out 2 by 2. Or perhaps there was the use of a common source. Maybe there was a common oral tradition which had both aspects here, and Matthew redacted out of that 2 by 2, and Mark redacted out of the oral tradition the specific pairing. That could be the case. Or maybe it's the case that Matthew doesn't pair at all. So we can't be certain that Matthew's list provides the pairings Jesus made. The first 2 are sets of brothers, and Matthew may have coupled them for that reason alone. The connecting Chi before James in Matthew 10:2 fails to make it into some English translations, but that would indicate that Matthew creates 2 sets of disciples. The first set being brothers, sets of brothers, and the second set being the rest. So here you can see what I think are parallel accounts of the commissioning of the 12 to go out and do ministry work. I have a friend of mine who's spent decades studying New Testament scholarship. He does not think this is a parallel account, but I respectfully and kindly disagree with him here. So I've bolded the text, which I think helps support the case that this is a parallel account between the Gospels. Matthew, it's believed, wrote more thematically and not necessarily chronologically. And so here he may have had in mind that he wanted to write about the commissioning. This would be the design corroboration example. He wanted to write about the commissioning, but he thought, hey, it would be good if I confirmed what Mark had said about the 12 by first mentioning them by name, which he hadn't done in a list yet. So perhaps Matthew intentionally decided to do that. That's another explanation. All right, this is the heavy hitter. This is an example which many advocates believe is a strong example of an undesigned coincidence. I will admit I think this is the strongest one of the lot. By the lot, I'm referring specifically to the inter-Synoptic, the alleged inter-Synoptic undesigned coincidences. In Matthew 14, we read that Herod speaks to his servants pertaining to his concern that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. How does Matthew know that Herod spoke to his servants? Matthew wasn't there. He wasn't in the court. How would he know this? The answer to this supposed undesigned coincidence comes from Luke 8, where Luke mentions Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Since the passage is not about Herod, so this is not a parallel account, Luke's mentioning Chuza in passing appears unintentional in confirming how Matthew knew what Herod had said. That is, Matthew had eyewitness testimony from within Herod's court because Joanna was a follower of Jesus and her husband had some interesting details to share over dinner one night. McGrew says the connection cannot possibly be the result of design. And there you have the verse there from Luke. Luke Timothy Johnson and Todd Penner say Luke tells us that he had some reports from eyewitnesses. Perhaps his unusually good information on Herod's household came from such a source. Now, another possible explanation comes from Acts 13, Manaen, whom Luke mentions as being, depending upon your translation, Herod's steward. So that could be another possible source for this material, which, if that were the case, then it would still work as an undesigned coincidence. You still have this incidental remark. So let me say this first. First, in terms of a logical possibility, it could be that Luke intentionally mentions Joanna to confirm Matthew's description. That is a logical possibility, but it is highly unlikely. Very unlikely that that's the case. But a logical possibility nonetheless. Option number 2, oral tradition. Suppose that the information originally came from Joanna. Hey, this is awesome, right? Great stuff. We know where this story came from. But think of this. If she had a written account, maybe notes, or simply were the source of an oral tradition, and if she were mentioned as the source therein, so in the teaching of the church, Joanna, everyone knows Joanna. She's one of the followers from Jerusalem. She tells us this story. And then there goes the story. If that were there, you would have both details in the common source, like I had mentioned. Now, is there external evidence for this option? No, there is not. But this is, I think, a plausible explanation of the phenomenon that we see. In this case, if there were a common source, Matthew provides one detail to his servants. Mark and Luke redact that detail. And they, in fact, redact in their parallel accounts that it came from Joanna or Manaen, whoever the source was. But this would prove a plausible alternative to the idea of the coincidental nature. Let me show you here the parallel accounts between Matthew and Mark. And I don't have Luke up here because Luke changes. Luke, if you can see my red pointer here, Luke provides this information earlier in Luke chapter 3, and he provides this information here up in Luke 9. So he sort of separates the material and uses it at different parts in his gospel. But let's just take a moment and look at the parallel here, parallel accounts. I've used different color coding system so you can see the similarities between them. Some of them word for word, but certainly concept for concept. Very closely concept for concept. Okay? Take a moment there, familiarize yourself, because I think this is going to be important for my next proposal, the third option. We can see the similarities. Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Okay, they're saying the same thing. Right? And you see that over and over and over again. Especially towards the end. In his book, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, Craig Blomberg suggests 6 points for identifying an instance of redaction criticism. First, focus especially on transitional sentences or paragraphs that connect one section to the next. This doesn't qualify there. We're not going from one section to another. Second, look for statements that summarize previous material, pointing out crucial concepts that are being stressed. What would we think about this? If Mark had been written first, some said John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers at work in him. But others said he is Elijah. And others said he is a prophet like the one of the prophets of old. Who are these some? Who are these some? Which people are saying this? And saying it seemingly in a context to Herod. What I want to suggest to you, and I'm going to go through some of these other points of criteria that Blomberg has, is that if Mark wrote first, what Matthew is doing here is making a safe assumption that these are the servants of Herod. He said to his servants, if Mark wrote first, you can see how close Matthew is copying this account from Mark. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, when Herod's birthday came. If Matthew is copying Mark's account, perhaps he doesn't have independent access here to the story. Perhaps Matthew is simply redacting, he is compressing, or better yet, condensing this passage here. Now, I do want to say here, I'm looking forward to Lydia's talk later on fictionalizing. These principles are applied from Blomberg's book. This is not later Richard Burridge, Mike Licona, genre, Greco-Roman BOI argument. Okay? What I'm suggesting here does not require that view. I'm taking the principles laid out here in Blomberg's work and applying them to this pericope. All right, let me go through a couple other criteria. Note editorial asides and explanatory comments. That doesn't fit here. You do see that elsewhere. 4, examine changes to source material where they can be identified. What has been added or omitted, highlighted or played down. I think this would qualify for that case. Matthew is playing down what the people said. And also, how many people are in Herod's court that are not servants? Maybe there are a few, family members, wife, a brother. Everyone else, though, would be a servant of Herod. So I think here that Matthew's making a safe assumption in terms of who those people were. This type of minor variation in word order occurs with virtually every pair of gospel parallels, but does not call into question their historical reliability. Occasionally, however, the changes are substantial enough that the two versions could be taken as contradictory, but in each case they need not be. Now, Blomberg is not writing specifically with regard to this pericope, but he's drawing out a principle in terms of paraphrasing. Here, I'm willing to suggest that this is not a case of minor variation. This would be a case of substantial variation, but of course the material is not contradictory in the least. Blomberg says substantial paraphrases of another person's speech are accepted as faithful to its original meaning, so there's no reason to object to the fact that the ancient world permitted a similar flexibility with written reports. So, this is the third option I propose to you. This is paraphrasing, specifically compression, and really condensing compression doesn't necessarily entail a condensing of the details, but I think that's what Matthew's doing here. There you can look at it one more time. Okay, let's move along to the woes. We're doing okay on time. In Matthew 11, Jesus mentions Bethsaida among the cities to which woe is coming. Why would he do this? There's no miracle mentioned in Matthew that occurs there. You can see the woe passage. The answer to this question can be found in Luke 9, who mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 occurs at Bethsaida. There's also, more specifically, there's a man that's healed there, right before that. So you plausibly have within the city walls, if that's a fair statement here. Okay, let's consider the concerns here. Well, if Luke wrote first, by which I mean wrote before Matthew. I don't mean to imply here that Luke was first and then Mark, Matthew, or Matthew, then Mark. I mean that Luke was written before Matthew. If Matthew drew from Luke's gospel, there would be strong literary dependence because the woe passage is nearly identical between them. And therefore, the material in Matthew would not be independent. Or consider Matthean priority. If Luke drew from Matthew, then he could have copied the woe passage and thought it worthwhile to mention a miracle that had occurred in that city. That would be a designed corroboration. It's not coincidental. Is that the case? Maybe not. Or maybe there's a common source here. The woe passage is Q material. Perhaps there's something going on there. But I think we need to step back and say, is this even a plausible undesigned coincidence? Or even a designed corroboration? I don't think so. I think a much simpler explanation exists, which does not require another gospel to confirm why Matthew has Jesus mentioning Bethsaida. The end of Matthew 4 tells us that Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and that large crowds from Galilee followed him. So we don't need Luke to explain why Matthew mentions Bethsaida, or why we even have no answer to Chorazin. We have the answer within Matthew's own gospel. This was Jesus' Capernaum, and the surrounding region was Jesus' base of operations. This is the claim that Leon Morris points out with regard to Matthew 4:13. He concludes, Jesus made Capernaum the center of his ministry rather than his hometown. Blomberg states Capernaum was larger and more significant than Nazareth and strategic in its lakeside setting on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Again, Chorazin is never mentioned anywhere else outside of the woe passages. We do not have any event explicitly mentioned in the Gospels that occurs in Chorazin. So in that same way, except in this case, we have that explanation. Because a couple chapters earlier, Matthew provides the explanation. This is where Jesus lived and worked. And so even if we don't have a specific example, we still have an explanation. Here, the woe passages are side by side, so in case you think that Luke was written before Matthew, you can see how much he copies. McGrew says, while the woes are not unique to Matthew, because they are also in Luke, this undesigned coincidence confirms Matthew's and Luke's independence from Mark at this point, and their reliability on the matters they report independently of Mark. Okay, that is useful, but that doesn't make it an undesigned coincidence between Matthew and Luke. Furthermore, you don't need both of them working conjunctively to show independence from Mark. So all that we're left with is that we have some independent material either in Matthew or Luke. And that's great, but again, that's not an undesigned coincidence. All right, the last example. Ownership of a new tomb. In Luke 23:53, we are told that Jesus was laid within a tomb cut in stone where no one had ever yet been laid. Joseph of Arimathea laid him there. So the question might arise is, how did Joseph of Arimathea come to have access to a new tomb that had never been used before? There we have Luke 23:53. He took it down, wrapped it in a linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb cut in stone where no one had yet been laid. The answer comes from Matthew 27. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Here are the concerns. These are parallel accounts. They're talking about the death of Jesus, specifically his burial. Suppose this information were available in Q or even the oral tradition. I think it's extremely plausible that the oral tradition, the teachings of the apostles, included this information. If that were the case, we see that Matthew includes it, but Luke redacts it. So you have both parts of the undesigned coincidence within the oral tradition. And the same could be for Mark. Or suppose Luke in priority, just for argument's sake. If Luke had written his gospel prior to Matthew, and Matthew drew material from it, then Matthew could have asked around for more information about the tomb. So this would be a design corroboration. That's more on the logical possibility side of things. I think the oral tradition position would be stronger in this instance. But suppose you reject the Q material, or that this is even in the oral tradition. Maybe you have a good example of an undesigned coincidence here. That's why this all depends. It depends on what your view is on the synoptic problem and source criticism. Here are the three synoptic gospels on the ownership of the new tomb passage. So you can see here how they relate, their similarities. Seems like this is part of the teaching of the apostles. This is part of the stories being told. And I don't mean abstractly differently. I mean, this was the teaching of the church, and the way that the evangelists communicated that varied. But it didn't vary all that much. Blunt says, truths known independently to each of them. We've gone over this one, but we'll do it again. Truths known independently to each of them must be at the bottom of documents having such discrepancies and such agreements as these in question. The point, therefore, whether the authors of the books of Scripture have or have not copied from one another, which in the case of some of them has been so much labored, it thus rendered a matter of comparative indifference. I would beg to differ. I think, as I've shown with these four examples, the synoptic problem could pose an obstacle to the confidence we place in the alleged inter-Synoptic undesigned coincidences. And again, this depends on your view of the synoptic problem and your view of source criticism. Here's a chart that I've made. This could be imperfect. Happy to edit as necessary. I see some of it's cut off here, unfortunately, but you can see the striking of Jesus example that we first started off with. Then we have the four that we went through, and these two were also part of those two concerns that are placed aside. So what Lydia has intended to do here was provide what she thinks is the best examples given Mark in priority. She didn't want the other examples to come across as that people would easily so dismiss them because Mark in priority seems like it would pose a problem there. I do want to say this. I think that those types of arguments and some others here are suited better if Matthew were written first. You might think that, hey, so if so much of it was in the oral tradition, then you just have loads of extra material out there, which maybe you do, because, I mean, you're talking 15 years before Paul's writings and 30 years before the Gospels. Maybe there were lots of stories being told and taught in the churches about Jesus. Maybe there was a lot of material. Even John says that there's all this material, though, Jesus said and did, but he just doesn't have the space to write about it. But it just doesn't seem as likely that that would be the case for some of these examples. So I think that Matthean priority would be a stronger position given these issues. But as you can see here, I have provided, if Mark and priority were first, were the case, then I have provided what I think are plausible explanations for the phenomenon that we see, which means that the synoptic problem, in conjunction with one's view of source criticism, would lead to us to hold off on saying that these are strong examples of undesigned coincidences. We are told that undesigned coincidences are like independent eyewitnesses telling their own version of the story and having a side comment or a throwaway remark coincide with each other across the narratives. This is certainly the case sometimes, but in other cases, specifically with regard to the inter-Synoptic alleged undesigned coincidences, we may be neglecting to consider the extent of the literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels, their sources, and their methods. Thank you.